This is a first draft. Road Film, aka Off to See the World's Biggest Rock and Roll Band, by Java John Goldacker, August 2019. As far as rock and roll stories go, I've heard many over the past 50 years. Stories from fans, stories from venue keepers, and stories from the stars themselves. Stories from the funny to the sad, from the pompous to the ridiculous. Although you knew it had to be true. Because it was rock and roll, and we had sold our souls for rock and roll. At least on the weekends. But I'm not sure that any rock and roll tale can beat the one that I'm about to tell you. And this one is true. I've loved live performances ever since my grandfather took me to see my Uncle Tom, who was a part of the June Taylor Dancers and performed on the Jackie Gleason show live from the sun and fun capital of the world, Miami Beach. Also, my folks took me to the wonderful Dade County Youth Fair in those years of 1969 to 73. And my preteen self got to see the likes of Kenny Rogers in the first edition there, along with Johnny Nash, the Grassroots, and a young lady on her first tour of the U.S., Tanya Tucker. Blew my budding little hippie mind. I was 17 years old in the glorious year of 1977, a year that would prove to be the most adventurous year across the nation for rock and roll souls that were my peers. I, like many, would see most of the major rock and roll bands of that era, including the Eagles, Pink Floyd, The Who, Heart, Jethro Tull, Boston, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, Jimmy Buffett, Eric Clapton, Chicago, Styx, Jackson Browne, Neil Young, Peter Frampton, and many others in 1977. They are the soundtrack for that year. The age of the concert stadium was upon us, and it was in full bloom, like the warm smell of colitis rising up through the air. The motley crew that I hung out with in South Florida, I also spent much time on the Spaced Coast, but that's a whole nother story, and a boring one at that. The South Florida crew were the best. They were my best friends, and they included Tubes McGilroy, Lorelei and Malags, George, Paul, and Rango. Usually at least two of us out of this crew would adventure to a rock concert nearly every week that year. And I was always trying to make sure I was in that car. Also, at least one of the names above are made up to protect the guilty. I'd like to say one of the great things about these friends of mine at the time, and still today, is our shared passion for music. But that passion can sometimes be expensive. So oftentimes we had ingenious ways of sneaking into venues if we couldn't afford a show. A few of us did this as frequently as we did buy tickets, until we turned 18 and realized that jumping the wall could put us in jail. I'll tell you, there were distractions at the turnstiles, bribes with doobies at some venues. Sadly, there were battles with the police. They were not instigated by nor participated in by my friends and I, but it was often a great distraction to sneak in elsewhere in the facility. We jumped barriers, pulled on windows to find an open one, and climbed over walls to get in shows. Hell, in Miami, We were once threatened by the police with water hoses if we didn't come off the roof of the DMV building across the street from the Miami baseball stadium after ingesting some sort of purple mushroom Kool-Aid. Not the police, us. Hope the statute of limitations for concert crashing has passed. But the adventure that truly stands out the most at the time that surrounds 1977 is the time that we journeyed from South Florida to the Time Coast to see the world's biggest rock and roll band. It was truly amazing in that year that you could see the biggest rock and roll band in the world for only $10. So we purchased our tickets in South Florida weeks before, if not months before the show. And the tickets themselves, they were gorgeous. They were emblazoned with the logo of the world's greatest rock and roll band. Because you see, in 1977, $10 was quite an expensive ticket. And that same year, I saw Heart in concert for only $5 in the second row. The Little Queen tour. It was a very cool show. I was right there in the center between both Ann and Nancy Wilson. You could definitely see the influence on Heart from the world's biggest rock and roll band. And that was great. Then came the night before the show. Myself and 6 of my best friends were taking a road trip to see the greatest band in the world finally. Now, normally I'd have ridden with Tubes in his Mad Maverick, but it really wasn't comfortable with over 5 people traveling in it. So I ended up making the drive with George and a friend of his that I didn't know, and another guy that sadly had severe physical impairments. I'm going to call him Benny. And I'll call the car we were in the Dopey Delta. The night before the greatest band in the world were set to perform, we all made our preparations to hit the road. Of course, we needed our alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages, and assorted mind and mood altering substances, and well, that was about it. Because there were so many of us in this crew, it was always a bit of a clusterfuck to leave and get anywhere on time, much less a 4-hour trip through the backwoods swamps of the Sunshine State to the Time Coast. We were like a tourist in a clock shop trying to get there. So George and I went ahead and took off from the rest of the crew that were headed in the Mad Maverick, knowing that we would meet up with them at the stadium the next day. We left South Miami sometime after midnight on May the 4th. And we were hoping the 4th would be with us. With a spark of a doob and a crack of a beer, we headed out for the legendary Tamiami Trail. But as we passed through Venice, Florida, the foil from a cigarette package flew out the driver's window of the car just as a police officer was passing. The shininess caught his eye, and he did a U-turn bigger than shit and pulled us over. We thought we were screwed with the pot we had on us. But when he saw that we had a case of the best imported beer in the car, he instructed us to take what we had in our hands and dump it out. Then he asked us to take the bottles in our hands and take them to a strong box in the trunk of his car. When we eliminated all the beers from our car and put them into his car, he then told us to enjoy the concert and drove away. Damn it! Where the hell else were we going to find beer at 3 a.m. in the morning on the west coast of Florida? Better spark up a doob instead. So we arrived at the beach on the Time Coast at daybreak. The concert gates would not be open until noon, with the greatest band in the world taking the stage sometime after 7 p.m. So we decided we would nap on the beach till late morning, then later visit the local mall. We were rudely awakened about 10 a.m. by the time police. They ended up being very nice guys who were just jealous that they weren't going to see the greatest band in the world, and they had to do their job. Little did we know that later in the day, they would have a pretty tough adventure in front of them. Or for us, that matter. While we were at the mall, we tried to have some fun going to that gag store, you know, the one that was in all the malls at the time. Also, we were drowning our sorrows, or our joy, in orange Julius's. We must have looked quite strange to the largely straight-laced Anita Bryant-type residents of the Time Coast shopping there. Then we stopped by a smoke shop in the mall, and we bought some rolling papers that were printed to look like cigarettes. And we bought these menthol flavoring drops that you could drop onto the weed to disguise the smell. And we ended up rolling a couple joints in a rolling machine to make perfect cigarette-looking joints that we smoked while we walked through the mall. Oh, and I ended up acquiring a very cool pipe that reminded me of the one that Sherlock Holmes used that would prove to come in quite handy later in the day. We arrived at the stadium about the time the gates opened and immediately began looking for the rest of our crew. As we were walking up to the stadium, there was a patch of bushes that we could slip into and burn a quick one, just like it was nature's way. When we crawled inside, we found a bottle of tequila unopened that we promptly opened. Duh. And then we put the remaining back in the car when we were finished. We then went back on the hunt for our friends. So we entered the stadium somewhere around high noon. Somehow I got split apart from George and his friends, so I spent the afternoon looking for Tubes and the crew that was in the Mad Maverick. A very strange thing happened as I walked around that whole stadium of 100,000 people looking for my friends. It seemed as if everybody there were my friends. Every time I turned around, somebody was offering me something to ingest. Mostly it was pot, but it was to a degree that I had never seen nor smoked before. The one person I did run into was the one person that I always ran into concerts back in the day, Cherokee. Cherokee was probably the first true hippie chick I ever knew and became friends with. We met a few years early on the Miracle Mile in Coral Gables when a friend of mine and I were hanging out, and a very pretty young lady came up and asked us if we'd be interested in hearing about this new thing called Scientology. Sure, we said. We were never one to miss the opportunity to follow a pretty girl. So we went inside the building of this new cultural phenomenon, and after about 10 minutes of the spiel, I got up and left. One of my buddies stayed, and I have no idea for how long. He may still be there. So I went back out to the Miracle Mile with my buddy, and another pretty young lady comes up, and she asked me if I'd like to go smoke a joint with her and her boyfriend. Same rule as above applies to going to smoke a joint. That was Cherokee. My other pals split. I went back to the famous La Palma Hotel with Cherokee. The La Palma was an old building, an old Spanish-style building that housed some really run-down apartments. They happened to be living in the penthouse suite, which basically was one of a few rooms on the top of the building that were one-room light bulb type affairs. Then Cherokee introduces me to her boyfriend, Dusty. We sipped a little wine and smoked a little weed. Cherokee said she had grown the pot, which blew my mind because I had never heard or known anybody that had grown it before. After a little bit, I looked around because I needed to use the restroom, and I realized there was none in this one-room penthouse. What do you guys do when you need to take a leak around here? Well, the restroom is in a very classy restaurant on the ground floor of the La Palma Hotel. Dusty said to take an ice bucket, get some ice while I was down there. Oh, by the way, if nobody's working, grab a bottle of that wine too, please. So we partied a little longer, finishing off that bottle. I was in a chair over in the corner and passed out for a little bit. As I started to wake up, I realized that there was sex going on in that room. It was rather awkward, so I acted like I was sleeping for a little longer until they were done. But I knew the free love was truly here. Except I wasn't getting any yet. I left there to go to work that night at Jan's ice cream parlor. I never did see or hear from Dusty again, but as I mentioned, I was running into Cherokee from time to time at rock concerts. That hippie chick had stole a little piece of my heart. On the way to John's ice cream, I stopped at the local record store on the mile to see what was happening. As I came in, Leon Russell was blaring over the speakers. Now, all I knew at the time about Leon Russell was he had the hit called Tightrope. The triple LP set that was playing was Leon Live. And it was on display in all its glory on the now playing stand. My mind was blown. I asked the guy behind the counter how much the triple record set was. $6.39, he said. Although I thought that was a great price for a 3-record set, I didn't have that much money and told him I'd have to wait and see if I made any tips that night at the ice cream parlor. The guy behind the counter said, "Fuck it. Go ahead and take it. We already have 3 open copies back here anyhow." Therefore, kicking off my lifelong love of the music of Leon Russell. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, back at the stadium, waiting for the world's greatest rock band. I briefly ran into George, and he had somehow lost the pack of cigarettes that we had filled with joints and some other substance that we were going to sell. We spent a little time backtracking and looking for it, but it was gone forever. And that was okay, because it was everywhere that day. It was a beautiful day, and nobody was lacking for a buzz. Although I did lose George again, and I wouldn't see him until the show was over back at the car. As the day grew longer, I realized there was a surprising lack of Time Coast police in the stadium. Huh. Little did we know that the cops were outside with their hands filled that day. It seemed that everybody in the world wanted to see the greatest band in the world, and things were about to get